Okay, what if I told you the CIA had this whole plan to teach people how to leave their bodies, travel through time, and even spy on enemies using just their minds? I know, it sounds like something straight out of science fiction, but it's not. It's real. Today, we're cracking open a recently declassified document that pulls back the curtain on the US government's absolutely bizarre research into something they called the Gateway Process.
I mean, this really gets to the core of it, right? Could the U.S. Army actually teach its soldiers to have out-of-body experiences on command? And look, we're not just talking about some deep meditation here. We're talking about the ability to perceive other dimensions, maybe even travel through time and space using nothing but your consciousness. And as wild as that sounds, you've got to understand they took this very seriously.
And the proof? The proof for this incredible quest is right here, in this very real, once top-secret document. This is a report from 1983, written for the CIA. And it's not just some manual, it goes way deeper. It tries to build an entire scientific framework to explain why leaving your body might actually be possible.
So this whole plan for consciousness was a really interesting partnership. You had the U.S. Army Intelligence and Security Command, that's INSCOM, teaming up with a civilian research group called the Monroe Institute. And their shared goal? Well, it was audacious to say the least. They wanted to figure out if you could systematically train human consciousness to work outside the limits of the physical body.
Okay, so to really wrap your head around how this was all supposed to work, we've got to dive into some pretty unconventional science. The entire gateway theory is built on one single foundational idea, that the universe and our consciousness in it is all just a super complex system of vibrations. And that leads us to the main thinker who basically drew up the blueprint for all this.
And this is the guy, Itzhak Bentov. He was an inventor, a scientist, and also a mystic. His theories were pretty much the intellectual engine driving the whole gateway process. What he did was build this kind of conceptual bridge, connecting the hard science of physics with the, mystical world of consciousness. And that's what gave the Army's pretty outlandish goals a sheen of scientific legitimacy.
Bentov's main idea is really captured perfectly with this analogy of a radio. He suggested that consciousness isn't created by your brain. Nope. Instead, the brain just acts like a receiver. The signal, which is consciousness itself, is this universal field that's just out there, always present. Your brain just tunes into it. And think about what that means. If you could just learn how to adjust your brain's frequency, you could theoretically tap into all sorts of new signals.
And this idea leads to something even bigger, the holographic model of the universe. You know how with a hologram, if you break off a tiny piece, that little piece still contains the entire image? Well, this model suggests the universe works exactly the same way, that all information is everywhere all at once. So if your mind could just tune into this universal data field, you could theoretically access information from any place or any time. And that became the so-called scientific justification for things like remote viewing.
All right, so if reality is a giant hologram and our brain is just a receiver, the big question is, how do you actually learn to change the channel? Well, this is where the gateway process gets down to the nitty-gritty. It laid out a very specific technique for essentially hacking consciousness, and the key to the whole thing? It was sound.
The technology they used was developed by Robert Monroe, and it's called HemiSync. That's short for hemispheric synchronization. And its whole purpose is pretty straightforward. It's designed to force the left and right sides of your brain to work together in this really coherent, unified way, a state that our brains just don't normally get into.
So how does it actually work? Well, HemiSync uses this really clever auditory trick called binaural beats. Here's the idea. You play one frequency in your left ear, let's say 100 Hz, and a slightly different one in your right ear, like 104 Hz. Your brain gets these two different signals and it can't quite figure it out, so it creates this phantom beat at the difference between them, which is 4 Hz. And here's the magic part. 4 Hz just so happens to be the frequency of the theta brainwave state. That's the exact state you're in during deep meditation, dreaming, and moments of real creativity.
And this whole process was laid out to guide a person through very distinct stages. First, you've got brainwave synchronization, which uses that hemisync to get your brain aligned. That then leads to resonant energy coherence, where your body's entire energy field is supposed to start vibrating in harmony. From there, your awareness starts to expand beyond the physical, which ultimately leads to these transcendent states. And that's the point where out-of-body experiences are supposed to become possible.
The Monroe Institute even drew up a kind of map for these states of consciousness. They called them focus levels. So the journey starts at focus 10, which is basically mind awake, body asleep.
Then you can move on to Focus 12, which is a state of expanded awareness. But this is where it gets really strange. They claim that at Focus 15, a person could perceive things outside of normal, linear time. And at Focus 21, you could supposedly become aware of entirely different dimensions.
Okay, this all brings up a massive question, right? Why on earth was the US military so invested in a psychic quest to explore other dimensions? And the answer, as it so often was back then, boils down to two words: the Cold War. In that high-stakes game of global espionage, both sides were desperate for literally any kind of advantage over the other.
And the potential military uses for this stuff? I mean, they were straight out of a spy thriller. Just imagine being able to use remote viewing to spy on an enemy base from thousands of miles away. Or what about enhancing a commander's intuition so they could make better life-or-death decisions on the battlefield? And maybe the most chilling idea of all was that you could weaponize this to influence an adversary's thoughts from a distance.
So what happened? Did it work? Did the Army actually end up with a squad of psychic spies? Well, the official conclusion to the whole program is, in its own way, just as interesting as the premise, and it reveals a legacy that's still with us today.
The final report was, well, it was a fascinating hedge, really. On one hand, the author basically said, look, within its own weird framework of physics and consciousness, the process seems plausible. But on the other hand, when it came to hard, empirical proof, the results were inconclusive. They couldn't get repeatable, measurable effects. So the official verdict was basically a shrug. Needs more research.
But even though the official military program got shelved, the story definitely doesn't end there. Because when this document was finally declassified back in 2003, these ideas just exploded into the public consciousness. You can see the echoes of the gateway process everywhere today, in neuroscience, meditation research, spiritual psychology, and of course, it's become a cornerstone of internet lore and pop culture.
When you really get down to it, the most lasting legacy of the gateway process wasn't creating psychic soldiers. It was about creating a bridge. It built this incredibly detailed framework that took ancient spiritual ideas, things like enlightenment and out-of-body experiences, and tried to translate them into the modern language of physics, talking about energy resonance and holograms.
And in the end, the Gateway Report leaves us with this really profound final thought. Whether the science was sound or not, this project stands as one of history's most audacious attempts to actually map our inner cosmos. It's this powerful reminder that maybe the ultimate laboratory for discovery and the greatest mysteries left to solve aren't out there in the stars, but they're right here, inside the human mind itself.